morning, everyone. I'm Bruce Hitchner, the chairman of the Peace Corps Project based at Tufts University. And I want to welcome you this morning to the first session on the UN Security Council Resolution 1244 and final status for Kosovo. By and large, as everyone recognizes, Kosovo is perhaps the most critical problem. The future of Kosovo is the most critical problem facing Southeast Europe today. Since 2000, the country has been, the province, if you will, has been managed under the mandate of the Security Council Resolution 1244. It is, in effect, a UN protectorate. One of the critical issues is that over the past two years or so, there has been a growing realization that the process that 1244 is effectively intended to undertake, which is the preparation or creation of institutions for a functioning Kosovo, has gone on in a way that I think many people realize cannot go on much longer. The events of last March indicate that the process is moving dynamically in a direction which I think many people would rather not see it go. There are, in effect, for this reason, many, many lessons, I think, to be learned about the process of the last 5 years. And I think there are also many things that we hope in today's session to consider about the future. Clearly, over the next year or so, there will be movement on the part of the international community, but the nature of that movement remains very uncertain. And I think while there is some reason for optimism, I think it's also fair to say that hopes could be dashed easily, given the tenor of the last 2 years. So with those things in mind, I'd like to introduce our speakers this morning very briefly. Ambassador Gordon Bromowitz is a senior fellow at the Century Foundation, and he is a former ambassador to Turkey and Assistant Secretary of State. Ilir Dujoli is the senior political advisor to Prime Minister Rejepi in the Provisional Government of Kosovo. Jim Hooper is the managing director of the Public International Law and Policy Group and the former director of the Washington Office of the International Crisis Group. And Gordon Thompson is currently the executive director of the Institute for Resource and Security Studies in Cambridge, Massachusetts. So, without further ado, I'd like to introduce Ambassador Gordon Bromowitz to the audience. Thank you.
Thank you. Before I make my formal comments, I'd like to make two observations. One is to note that the analysis on the Balkans tends to fall into two classes. Those who, at least the southern Balkans, those who tend to see the glass as half full, and those who see the glass as half empty. Those who see the glass full tend to be officials and tend to be those who have been heavily invested in everything that has happened in the Balkans. Those who tend to see the glass empty tend to be skeptics of the wisdom and nature of the way governments have evolved in handling the various Balkan issues. I tend to be optimistic but very skeptical. The second thing I would notice is patience. Democracies, particularly the United States, have extraordinary other interests. And then when those other interests arise, previous interests that consume enormous amount of time suddenly become less and less important. The willingness to spend time, you get second-rate bureaucrats coming into the government. So that's what sort of happened within the State Department by and large. Kosovo, particularly, which I'm going to focus on, and the Balkans in general have lost a lot of salience. And by and large, we've tended to pass over responsibility to the Europeans, where I believe it actually should belong. Now, I will try to be brief and good. I will start off by saying we have three dysfunctional states in the Balkans, from the former southern part of Yugoslavia. Macedonia is a tenuous state, but not a dysfunctional one. The absence of war should not be taken as a sign of a statecraft. We have done many good things, but there's still much to be done. The dominant feature I find in the Balkans right now is malaise. Stability and growth are still elusive, and we could still see violence. Not necessarily 1992 variety, but violence which could upset efforts to establish better stability. Unfortunately, as I said, in the U.S., the Balkans has sunk into greater obscurity, tension. The so-called Serbia-Montenegro, the creature of Mr. Solana, is a joint state that everyone knows is not working. Serbia is rent by political divisions, and it's not yet decided whether it's in the 19th century or in the 21st century. Ambassador Hayes has presented a very, very fine, articulate picture of what is happening in Bosnia. It certainly has benefited from much Western reconstruction and enormous assistance. After 10 years, probably $50 to $75 billion the whole effort has cost. But it remains, for me at least, essentially a benevolent dictatorship of Patty Ashton. There is little ethnic reconciliation or willingness to make joint institutions run. It survives on outside aid, and its government is not likely to be improved without some change in Dayton. And on that score, I don't think any country wants to go down that road. Oh, perhaps, as the ambassador said, the EU will be the savior. I hope that's true. It's certainly possible. Kosovo is what I call the failed non-state. It has a freely elected government which is not allowed to rule. It has been significantly reconstructed, but it is fragile and economically declining. Kosovo, I believe, is the key to stability in the Balkans. Failure to resolve its status hinders its growth, keeps Serbia mired in the past, generates tensions in Macedonia and even in Bosnia, and makes progress and overall progress in the Balkans difficult. Not even the promise of EU integration, which is the dream of all these states, is sufficient to set aside this critical issue. Resolving Kosovo may not lead to peace and progress in the Balkans, but not resolving it will certainly retard peace and progress. Now, what have we learned, if anything, from the experience of Kosovo? I'm not going to talk about Reconstruction or about the pillar system or what OSCE should do, what the UN should do. Those are all important things, but others know more about them than I do. I have some brief thoughts about lessons learned, which are slightly different than perhaps. The first lesson will probably never be learned for obvious reasons. The way wars end are critical to the post-war evolution. The understandably intense interest in achieving peace in a not popular war usually do not lead to good post-war results. The way we conducted and ended the war in Kosovo, despite our preeminent military position, left Milosevic and his forces intact and with a juridical role in Kosovo. Secondly, probably more acceptable, is that delay in resolving issues in the Balkans, what I call exporting problems to the future, invariably makes the problems more difficult to resolve. After Milosevic's fall, we had another good time to resolve the Kosovo issue, at least to make publicly clear that the province would never again be ruled by Serbia. The West was worried about the Serbian reformers. They didn't want too much on their plates. And they were divided over whether Kosovo independence or achievement of final status was a good thing. Western ambassadors in Belgrade, at least some of them, went so far as to tell Serb leaders that Kosovo would remain in some way part of Serbia. Thirdly, Allied unity has been the bane, or disunity, has been the bane of good decision-making in the region. It continues to lead to delay, to sending wrong signals, and to common denominator decision-making. Some allies are against Kosovo independence, some are for it, some fear its repercussions, and some feel the situation's getting bad. The end result, we'll see next year. The end result has usually been indecision and delay in dealing with Balkan problems. Finally, because the West did not agree on Kosovo's future, we ended up not building a state, but rather a UN colony. The country was restored, but the economy stagnated. Not enough people were trained, and the elections turned out to be mostly window dressing. Much has been the fault of the Kosovo leadership, but the West, in a sense, connived by developing standards before status, and thus putting off building a more serious ethnic entity, Kosovo entity. After all, its father, Michael Steiner, said his job in Kosovo was not to build a nation. The experience probably also raises another long-term point. The longer an international occupation runs on, and I'm not sure this is true, but I raise it anyway, perhaps any occupation, the more it degenerates. UNMIK's reputation in Kosovo has gone way down among all the parties, and even in New York. Fortunately, they have a new director who happens to go quite well. She shows every signs of vigor, and hopefully we will see some changes. I might add another point I was thinking about, which may be wrong also. You don't get many benefits, it seems, by intervening to save Muslims who are not Arabs. The United States and its allies saved Kosovars, saved the Muslims of Bosnia. That has brought us no credit. And it's a very sad observation, but I think, unfortunately, it's true. Lastly, a few words about what is to be done. We reached the point where it's recognized in the contact group and in the United Nations that things in Kosovo somehow have to change. The present situation is untenable, which of course doesn't mean that anything will be done. We have seen the remarkable IDA report. Remarkable because a UN figure went out and said, UNMIK isn't working, and we got to do something about final status. That report has not been officially released. For the moment, and until the Kosovo elections and the American elections are over, everybody's marking time. I cannot truly rule out that they will continue to do more after the elections. If they do that, they do not do anything, then we will see further despair, potentially some violence, and further destabilization in the Kosovo economy with an impact on the whole area. Nor is it likely that any politician in Serbia will have the political courage or wherewithal to publicly give up on Kosovo. And Serbs have actually, I believe, prepared the ground, or have tried to prepare the ground for a partition. To deal with the Kosovo issue, you need to move in three general directions. Most immediately, to inject some dynamism into the Kosovo economy and to seriously begin to pass over more power to PISIC, terrible acronym, the institutions of self-government, original institutions. Lots of talk about this and moving UNMIK gradually out, but little has yet happened except, as I mentioned, the advent of a new UNMIK directive. Standards before status still gets semantic treatment. Secondly, sometimes next year, the concerned nations must come to agree on some process to reach final status. Right now, only one nation is ready to make a decision on final status, the Russians. The Russian position is that Kosovo is part of Serbia, and they're prepared to say that in my report now. This process will involve, at different times, three sets of discussions. In the contact group, in the UN forum because of 1244, where Russia also plays, as well as in the contact group, and perhaps between Serbia and Kosovo. Going beyond that point is difficult. The contact group made one important statement last month, saying the situation could not return to pre-1999 circumstances, but left that statement very vague at Russian behest. Contact group remains divided on what to do, although there is a considerable increase in the amount of discussion among the group members about the need to do something, to move up, and to move the UN mission out, or reduce it, or turn it over to the EU. There is now no serious discussion between Serbs and Kosovars, and I do not believe there will be one until Kosovo has a serious government. I would not rule out, although I think it unlikely, at some point, if there are serious talks between Serbs and Kosovars, Serbia and Kosovo, that there could be a partition. I think it's unlikely, but I would not rule it out. Fourthly, I believe that one of the next likely steps in the coming year is the appointment by the contact group of an envoy and a similar appointment by Kofi Annan to examine the problem of final status and to present some sort of blueprint for the parties to proceed. Finally, in the end, I do not believe Serbia's leaders will give up Kosovo unless it is made absolutely clear that they will never enter the EU with the Kosovo issue unresolved, and I'm not sure even that is enough in the divided country that Serbia is. It could require thus, in the end, the West finding a way to effectively impose a solution. Not an easy way. Any solution will also require the establishment of a functioning Kosovo government and a serious guarantee with appropriate measures for the protection of all minorities in Kosovo and indeed throughout the Balkans. And finally, it will also probably allow the need for the Serbs in Kosovo to maintain some sort of relationship, not territorial relationship, some sort of relationship with the Serbia and the Serbs of Serbia. Thank you.
Our next speaker is Darina Julie, the Special Foreign Policy Advisor.
Thank you, Bruce. I'm pleased to be here. For 5 years now, Kosovo has been contained within the framework of Resolution 1244. So everything that has been done there so far, its entire development, empowerment of the institution, everything in general related has been done with a very meticulous consideration of not violating, not expanding the limits that Resolution 1244 sets. And if the opinion regarding this resolution is to be set based on what has been achieved so far, then I'm afraid that we cannot be very happy and we cannot be very satisfied. Where do we stand 5 years after the war? Yes, there are a number of achievements that have been met, or the goals that has been achieved so far, and there's no doubt about that. Peace has been established, and as Ambassador Abramovich has mentioned, that is a tremendous achievement per se. Some amount of reconstruction also has been done, and then in general, there's been a promotion of human rights standards when it comes to legislation mainly, and trying also to meet that legislation also in the day-to-day attitude of the governmental bodies and also of single citizens. Some success in institution building also is worth to be noted. Yet, as we see from the daily news reports and most of the observations, the situation is far from being satisfactory, and not to say very, very unsatisfactory, with a number of shortcomings and failures. There is peace, yet there is no future, and this is exactly what is noted in the words of the unnamed Kosovar in the report of Ambassador Aide to the Secretary General. You gave us peace, yet you did not give us future, and this is a dominant perception, this is a dominant feeling amongst most of the Kosovars. Already in the year 2000, in early 2000, it was noted that it's necessary to proceed as far as possible with resolving the issue of the status. ICG and the Independent Commission on Kosovo both in early 2000 what are the contradictions and what are the problems of a resolution as such? Well, first and foremost, I believe that the basic problem is very obvious there. On one hand, the requirement to respect Yugoslavia's sovereignty, in contrary to the strive of the majority of the people. There can be no bigger deficiency, in my opinion, than setting a document which in one way is supposed to serve as the highest law of the land against the will of the people that it's supposed to serve, or the actions of who it's supposed to design. For things to be even worse, the kind of political bargaining that has accompanied designing of the Resolution 1244 has followed also on a daily basis when it comes to the daily management of the issues by the army itself. So what we've seen during these 5 years have been lots of political daily bargaining on various issues, which were not resolved by United Nations mission as such, but we have ended up with very lengthy discussions, bargaining, and political bargaining between liaison officers, between foreign officers of foreign countries, between United Nations, and so on and so forth. And without exception, in most of the cases, whether it be for elections, for criminal code, for customs, for taxes, and so on, UNMIK has been completely, in most of the cases, unable to deliver and to meet and to act on those instances. Kosovars today, citizens as such, in most of the areas, face lack of governance as such. Ambassador Browns has mentioned this problem, and this is, I believe, the most critical problem in general. And I'm not talking here from the point of view of the government official, of arguing and advocating empowerment as much as possible of these institutions, which also should not be a heresy by any means. In fact, it should be something that we should openly talk, if for nothing else, then at least for the sake of accountability and for the democratic system that we are trying to build there. But nonetheless, I look to this from the other point of view. From the point of view of simply having a government that is functioning, having a government that is delivering services and that is meeting the needs and requirements and is listening to the requirements of the citizens. As we have seen in March of this year, there in the lack of proper channels of communication, the United Nations mission is completely failed, and to a certain extent also institutions, to read the mood of the citizens. So in the want of these kind of channels, we are again going to fail to read the mood of the citizen and be unable to see what's going on there until in one way or the other it erupts and that surprises us all. So I believe that try to say more word about this deficiency that I consider to be critical. You cannot afford it, neither in Kosovo nor in any other places, to suspend in a way sovereignty and not to exercise it, to kind of be very possessive about the power and suffocate it and not exercise it on a daily basis on behalf of the citizens that you are put in place to govern, even if you are not accountable or elected by them, as the United Nations mission is in Kosovo. So, in addition to this contradiction that I just mentioned, one of the main difficulties of the Resolution 1244 is that it has been very rigidly interpreted when designing the basic legislation in Kosovo, starting from the constitutional framework, the basic document here, constitutional framework for provisional self-government, and then following also with every single other document. At the same time, there's a sense, when you look at the way that the work has been managed so far, that it did not provide a sufficient guidance to the United Nations mission in Kosovo and Pristina as such, and as a consequence of that, most of the issues were again dealt with political bargaining of diplomatic representatives and other representatives in Kosovo. This, per se, has caused us to find in most of the instances simply the most common denominator between the different positions, and that common denominator, not surprisingly, in most of the instances has been equal to not doing anything rather than moving things forward in any of the segments that you can mention. And further on, considered to be a kind of work in progress, this mission, this resolution, everything that has been designed and derived from this resolution, has not removed even on some of the basic uncertainties. Very real fear, as perceived by the Kosovars, is that threat of a return of self-government and so everything that personifies that government in Kosovo. This might be considered by international observers as not realistic, something that cannot happen one day or the other. But nonetheless, there are different indications that make this threat, this fear, this perception on the side of the ordinary citizens of Kosovo very, very real. And that is something that we cannot afford, I believe, to disregard. At the same time, this kind of perception on the side of Kosovo have helped some shifts in the policy that have occurred since 1999, when Resolution 1244 was adopted, and until now. For example, kind of vagueness of Resolution 1244 initially has provided some space for what the people at the United Nations Mission in Kosovo considered to be a boldness in their action and in their attitude, being capable immediately with the first SRSG to take some decisions in terms of that, setting more or less a clear legal system, not completely connected with the one in Serbia and other decisions related to this one. But nonetheless, this was possible only due to a very strong and unequivocal support by the major powers at that point, the United States, France, Germany, Italy, and the other. As the government has changed in Belgrade and circumstances have changed in Belgrade, that kind of boldness in interpreting this resolution has also diminished to a very, very considerable extent. In fact, we are not surprised even if we see different perceptions and interpretations of the resolution sometimes between diplomatic representatives in Pristina and in Belgrade, even of the same country. So, on top of all these, and not to take too much of the time available, one of the most serious segments, number one, I just mentioned, of deficiencies in current system by UNDIC is a discrepancy between aspirations to set a kind of nebulous, substantially self-governing entity on one hand, and also on the other hand, not grounding that attitude, those actions, what is being done on a daily basis by United Nations on democratic principle. This, as such, is, I believe, a very, very drastic omission, very big problem. Lack of independent judiciary, completely independent, which would be able to review, to provide a judicial review for the actions of the SRSU, for the actions of the United Nations personnel and mission, is something that does not set a good, proper example in Kosovo. So there is plenty of striking examples of a bit uncontrolled powers, and this is something that I afraid not only as a citizen, not only that I have problems with that as an employee of the government, but I have simply a problem as a lawyer at the end of the day, because unreserved power, uncontrolled power, even if it's set for very good intentions, is as such, I believe, a very problematic. If for nothing else, this is a very problematic design for the sake of the example that it aspires to set to the citizens that it is being designed to serve and to give the example. So with that note, I would conclude. And I thank you for your
Our next speaker is Jim Hooper of the Public International Law and Policy.
Place my chair at the choke point. I see. I should start off by saying that, making a confession. I agreed to do this because I was told that Mort was going to be on the panel, Mort of Romulus. And it's actually, I've been to 3 or 4 conferences where he's been the speaker and I speak after him. And I find it very easy. It's, he makes his presentation. I get up and say, me too. Mort is gratified. The audience is relieved. The organizers are able to make up for lost time. And I get a nice trip to, in this case, Boston. So, but I have a lesson learned myself. I learned it the hard way. Bruce was actually at the last conference where I tried that. And so he came up to me and said, you can't do it this time. We start with some of the realities, I think, that I see in the region in terms of how they affect Kosovo and its future. The first reality is, I believe, that Serbia's status as a regional power is waning. Its horizons are shrinking. It no longer casts a giant shadow over the Balkans. Serbian nationalism suffered a very serious setback as a result of Milosevic's wars and the progressive disengagement of Montenegro from its partnership with Belgrade. At the same time, Serbia's impetus for domestic political reforms and economic reforms is waning. Serbia remains a land of chill and darkness, a political and economic wasteland governed by a stunted and corrupt political elite, unwilling to embark on serious political and economic reforms to bring the country into the European mainstream, but too exhausted at present to muster the political will and sacrifices to seek borders reflecting the vision of Serbian nationalists. If Serbia were a website, the headline on the homepage would be "Abandon hope, all ye who enter here." Only some of the young and a few courageous individuals offer hope. Look for no solutions to Kosovo from Belgrade politicians who depend upon the West to deliver them from the quandaries. Third, the failure to can't read my own writing, but it's on what I scrawled out after Bruce caught me in the hallway there. The failure to choose and move beyond the loss of Kosovo for the Serbs continues to hobble Serbs from choosing between the new agendas of reform and the old nationalist agenda. And the international community has abetted Serbia's fantasies in this regard. Fourth, the region's Albanians are a rising power. While the Kosovo Albanians have had their economic and to some extent political vitality temporarily sapped by unmixed misrule, they are yet willing to be a responsible partner to the West in defining their place in the region. This is very significant. Kosovo Albanians will have a major role in shaping the political objectives, for better or worse, of the ethnic Albanians elsewhere in the Balkans, who took great pride and satisfaction and relief from the victory of NATO and the Kosovo Liberation Army over Serbia in 1999. Next, I think it's clear that Western assumptions die hard. Transatlantic bureaucracies and leading segments of their national security elites embrace the hardiest perennial of Balkan policymaking, the assumption that Serbia remains the linchpin of Balkan stability. In keeping their watch along the Drina, Western policymakers risk mishandling the Albanians, who are the new rising power in the South Balkans. Now, the dangling of EU membership rewards, of an EU membership rewards program, I think may well be working in Bosnia. That's what Don Hayes has said, and I think there is hope for that. But that doesn't work in Serbia, and it's not going to work. That's insufficient to persuade the Serbs to undertake decisive reforms. They view integration as an opportunity to avail themselves of the visa regime and subsidies, not as a requirement to change their values and change their political system toward reform and democratization. As for the UN, having squandered its standing in Kosovo, the UN has no constructive role left to play there, apart from monitoring. While the UN desperately needs to extricate itself from ruling Kosovo, its semi-colonial administrators are reluctant to voluntarily terminate their powers and purposes. Thus, an irresistible force may rise among the Kosovar Albanians to dislodge this immovable object. Time has run out on postponing final status. While it may be possible to make it to the end of this year with no more violence, similar to the March violence earlier this year, next year will be a year of reckoning. The Albanians remain among the most pro-American people in Europe. They still look to Washington to work with them to find a way forward. The problem is, in the U.S., no matter who wins the presidential race, there is going to be resistance to tussles with the European allies over Balkan matters, which are still regarded as a sideshow by most policymakers in Washington. So how to move forward? I think one needs to accept that stability in the Balkans depends upon the West shaping its policies to account for both the waning of Serbian power and the rise of muscular new power centers among the disparate ethnic Albanians. This will become dangerous if mishandled or ignored. Serbia needs to be ringed by states that encourage its democratic impulses, while at the same time help to contain, with Western backing, any future surge of nationalist power directed toward reshaping borders. The impetus for reform, democratization, and justice among the Albanian peoples of the Balkans would be relatively stabilizing if it were channeled into several viable states rather than one encompassing Albanian state. Thus, there is a considerable degree of potential overlap between the most stabilizing outcomes or objectives for Western policymakers. Keeping Kosovo together as a unitary and independent state within its current borders, perhaps minus the 3 small northern counties transferred to Kosovo from Serbia by Tito in the late 1950s, a fact for which I'm indebted to Louis Sell for reminding me of, and I think the territory which has little, I think the Kosovo Albanians care little about that particular territory, would diminish the likelihood of Kosovo's independence from setting off a violent chain reaction of ethnic Albanian instigated border adjustments involving also Macedonia, Montenegro, and Albania. Only the United States has the capacity to move events in this direction, though it would be unrealistic to base such a policy on an expectation of the bludgeoning of the European allies by Washington. A rough and ready understanding between the United States and the EU would be based on the premise that the EU had the primary responsibility for bringing Serbia along in this direction, while the U.S. would play the lead role with the Albanians. In effect, that is more or less what that would tend to enshrine the situation as it has been. The 3 prizes for achieving this would be the establishment of a reasonable foundation for Balkan stability. Second, the anchoring of the Albanian peoples, who again, I remind, are the rising power in the South Balkans. The anchoring of the Albanian peoples more firmly on a road toward deeper engagement with Western institutions through a de facto partnership with the U.S. And third, a functioning U.S.-European working relationship in a trouble-prone part of Europe where effective cooperation has often proven elusive among the Western allies. The means to do this, in terms of looking at the means to do this, I think probably what not to do may be more important than what to do. What's the greatest danger, in my view, is a regional conference that will attempt to solve all remaining issues in the Balkans at once. That's because Serbia will claim a prize, or seek to claim a prize, for just showing up. Be it northern Kosovo, Republika Srpska, parts of these, or other alternatives. What is needed instead is flexible, determined diplomacy, pressed relentlessly by the U.S. and the EU through whatever diplomatic groupings and mechanisms show the most promise. Russia's going to need to be finessed because, as Mort said, it has already signaled that it's playing its Serbia card on Kosovo, and it will be expected to be rewarded for doing what it has every intention of doing once again, selling out Belgrade. They may ask for something on Chechnya, it may be something else, I don't know, but they will ask for it, and we have to be prepared to take that into account. The air also needs to be let out of the UN balloon. The UN can only obstruct and delay a reckoning with reality on Kosovo's final status. Last, I would say that NGOs can make a difference to the outcome in Kosovo. They can help put it on the agenda, and they can help define the terms under which the discussion will take place and the context in which the decisions are made. Thank you.
Well, I think we would all agree that was something more than Me Too this time. Our final speaker is Gordon Thompson, the Executive Director of the Institute for Research and Security Studies.
I'm here representing a small NGO based in Cambridge. We have more than a decade of experience working in the former Yugoslavia on peace-building questions. My colleague Paul Galkov will be describing these to you tomorrow. The biggest lesson we learned from this experience is that the useful thing that we can contribute, organizations like ours can contribute, is to empower the people themselves and to work with them to help them as they become empowered, serve their own needs, and identify their own needs. So in talking here about policy options for Kosovo, I'm operating out of that paradigm. That's the big lesson that we've learned. Problems of Kosovo, of course, are well known. Conflict is continuing. The economy is in a low state of development. Financial inflows have declined. The first stage of the protectorate was a boom, and we're now seeing the inevitable bust. There's also fear that remittance income from the diaspora will further decline. Major obstacles to economic development include a lack of clarity about ownership of property and corporations, state corporations left over from the past, and the land that they're sitting on. There's very high risk to investors because it's unclear who's going to guarantee or insure that risk. And the poor state of the economy is clearly feeding social tension and conflict. So there's a spiral here that has the potential to spiral downward. And that's a great concern. Prospects in the longer term include the hope for eventual entry to the EU. But ultimately, that seems inevitable. If you look at the expansion of the EU, it's hard to imagine that 2 decades from now, Kosovo and the other states of the region will not somehow have been incorporated into the EU. The EU would be, I think, most concerned at that time if they had not, because having failed or weak states on their borders, or in fact within their wider borders, is a source of great instability. And there are reports of improvement in interethnic cooperation in Kosovo, so the picture is not entirely grim. Now, options for the future status. I'm not talking here about final status, and I'll explain that further. The status quo, we understand, has been discussed here. And the remaining options, the 5 other options I list here, are not the end of the list. Others could be set forth. Each option here has been put on the table by some significant player. There is no universal support behind any of these options, and all of them have their opponents. We in our institute take no position on the merits or otherwise any of these options. Partition is the first option in the category that assumes populations are separated and that there will be changes of borders. In this case, changes of external borders. The implication is that the remaining portion of Kosovo would become independent. Cantonization has been supported by a vote of the Serbian parliament earlier this year. Various versions of this could be imagined, but the basic idea is a change in internal borders where the Kosovo Serbs are consolidated in enclaves and have some ongoing relationship with Belgrade. And sometimes this is described as autonomy within autonomy. The remaining 3 options I've listed here all assume the present borders, internal and external borders, would remain and that somehow a multi-ethnic society would be made to work. Independence could be full or conditional. The International Crisis Group has talked about conditional independence, but has not, to my knowledge, defined it in any precise way. Autonomy could be done with linkage to Serbia in a variety of ways. It is not necessarily true that autonomy would require subservience to Belgrade. One could possibly imagine some federation solution. And the final option I list here is for the EU to take over the administration of Kosovo as a trust territory under the trusteeship provisions in the United Nations Charter. This option was set forth by Congressman Bereuter, recently retired senior member of the U.S. Congress, in an op-ed in the Wall Street Journal in late August. Now, when all these options are considered, who are the stakeholders? Obviously, the peoples of Kosovo and Serbia and Montenegro are the directly affected parties, but there are neighboring countries whose interests are intimately affected. Albania, Bosnia, Herzegovina, and former Yugoslav Republic of Macedonia have an intense interest in the outcome. And we have all the organs of the international community. In the longer term, I think the EU is definitely the most affected international community, and therefore the most likely to have a lasting commitment to whatever is the solution. The bottom of this list is international civil society, which of course is you and people like you, and I think that that's perhaps the greatest source of hope here, is the strength of this international civil society. Now, we're setting forth here a suggested process for determining status. Again, I'm not talking about final status. And this is the first presentation we've made about this suggested process, so I'm quite anxious to get feedback from people. There are two key features to the process. The first is to facilitate a broad-based dialogue among the peoples of Kosovo and Serbia and Montenegro to explore support for options that are clearly acceptable to them, but furthermore are acceptable to the neighboring countries with an intense interest and the international community. We believe that international civil society can and should assist this dialogue according to the paradigm I mentioned earlier of empowering the people themselves. If that dialogue can be productive in identifying options and the degree of support for them, we're suggesting that the OSCE, the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, would be an appropriate entity to convene diplomatic negotiations, which we describe as track 1, a familiar term to many, but perhaps not all here, be accompanied by discussions within civil society, which is generally described as track 2. And the preceding speaker has expressed concern about exactly this model, a regional conference, and there are certainly things to be said either way. We offer the OSCE because it brings together all relevant parties. It's a European-based entity. It has, in former decades, a very impressive history in bringing the Cold War to, helping to bring the Cold War to a satisfactory conclusion. And it has, in our judgment, the institutional capacity, secretariat, and the involvement of its participating nations terms of timeline for this process, we're suggesting here a very ambitious timeline. First phase, perhaps 6 to 12 months for the dialogue in Kosovo and Serbia and Montenegro, followed by a phase of similar length, 6 to 12 months involving diplomatic negotiation. This is a very short and ambitious timeline that, again, I offered for feedback. However, we've had statements made by previous speakers that there is a degree of crisis here and the situation cannot be allowed to remain unresolved too long. The scope of agreement could be confined just to the status of Kosovo. It could extend to the status of Montenegro as well, or it could extend even further to possible amendment of the Dayton Accord to Bosnia and Herzegovina. If the latter were to occur, and if Montenegro's status were to be incorporated, in each instance it would be necessary to have a dialogue process in parallel to the one that we talk about here for Kosovo. And all of this raises two strategic questions, one specific to Kosovo and one more global import. In the Kosovo situation, the question people need to think carefully about is to prioritize political settlement or economic development, or can both be done at once? There is often an assumption that if there is a quick settlement of status, then that resolves questions like ownership and the grounds for economic development laid. It is possible that grounds for economic development can be laid without an immediate resolution of the political status. And I think that's implied in the idea of a conditional independence, and it's also implied in the idea of an EU administration under trusteeship. That under forms of governance of that kind, one could settle ownership of assets, one could make binding agreements with international entities like the IMF and the World Bank, one could cover the political risk for inward investment and establish a stable configuration for economic development, leaving or deferring to later the political resolution. I leave this as a question to ponder, because the economic development is crucial to peace, and if it can be delinked in some way from political settlement and thereby economic development is accelerated, that's a prospect worth thinking about. And finally, the global question, should we think about separating populations, or should we insist on having multi-ethnic society? There's an ample history of petition of nations. British India was petitioned with great suffering. Czechoslovakia was, in fact, petitioned with no suffering or hardship. The EU is predicated on the idea of a multi-ethnic society. I would expect the EU to be very cautious about a strategy in Kosovo that involved separating populations through either partition or something like nationalization. Thank you.
We're now going to open the floor to questions to our speakers, and I'm going to ask the speakers they can respond. They don't need to come up to the podium.
Justice to all the speakers. And I'd like to use the word pluralism rather than multi-ethnic cooperation. In the very interesting and cogent presentation, we heard allusion to cultural differences. The last speaker mentioned something about insisting on a multi-ethnic state. We've also have some sense that pluralism and ethnic relations are handled by NGOs and civil society. But if pluralism is to be a goal, there would have to be some position taken by the states involved as well as the international agencies. It can't be a residual category. And I might say, for those of us who are Americans and see our country sometimes fatuously promoting democracy, but sometimes with some effectiveness, we hope that the long lines to the voting booths will lead to democracy. And in places like Afghanistan, can we simply leave pluralism as a residual goal, leave it to civil society and NGOs with limited resources rather than making it a paramount possibility?
I think when it, speaking on Kosovo, I think there is a profound difference among the Serbs in Kosovo as to multicultural society. I think in many ways both sides, in particular Serbian side, multiculturalism is, yes, they will live in Kosovo, but they will have their own society and will be very much not a part of Kosovo society. And a part of the Albanians, I think, by and large, they're probably going to acquiesce in that definition of multiculturalism and pluralism. I don't think there is, except in the West, I think there's a greater sense that it can be a much, much deeper thing. And certainly the EU has made that a flagship issue in terms of its insistence on what the Kosovars particularly must do. The problem I see is less the willingness of the international community and governments to actively foster it, but the problem within the populations. Right from the start, look, the Serb population is controlled by Belgrade. They will do what Belgrade wants. And by and large, their attitude is that someday Serb power will remain and they will not accept the institutions of a Kosovo or an independent Kosovo. So that I believe the problem is not the willingness of the international or the various governments to pursue a serious multicultural policy. The problem is that they're up against some very tough considerations. And this is one reason why I think the longer you perpetuate indecision about the future of Kosovo, the less likely you're going to make progress on this issue.
Well, that's on one hand, but on the other, will disappear. So that the gaps will be bridged, the ethnic will opposite use will diminish, and this is the way the kind of pluralism and multi-ethnicity of this concept will flourish. Which in my opinion is a very naive, if I may call it like that, attitude. And 5 years after the war has proven us wrong, use remain
Well, John Kerry is elected president and Richard Holbrooke is Secretary of State. Do you think that American policy will shift with respect to the Balkans? And if so, what impact do you see?
Well, I'll give you my personal view. I think Dick makes things happen. I think he has a different point of view than the existing powers in Washington. And I think his point of view is, if I've seen it expressed in newspapers and from conversations with him, is basically to try to move ahead on trying to get final status. On the other hand, anyone who comes into the government, in the, say, the Kerry government, is going to be interested in a number of other issues, and in bringing the Europeans on board on other issues, of which Iraq is obviously the one of most direct concern, the Middle East another. So that the ability to sort of, or that possibility of taking on the Europeans in an effort to, say, move stoutly toward trying to resolve final status may not have the priority that I think Holbrooke would have given to it in a different circumstance. So, I mean, these are personal reflections. I can't give you any more of that sort of analysis of what I think, where they think they're coming from. The Balkans is an extremely important part of his history. Feels it's important to him. And I think he feels that leaving the Balkans in much better shape than it is now is in deep American interest.
I would just say that it's hard to imagine the next administration being led by Senator John Kerry, or President John Kerry, or President George Bush being less active than the current administration has been involved. Don.
First of all, I think that you're probably overestimating our ability to be less involved. Secondly, I think you're overestimating the organizational strength of the European Union. If you think that the UN is unable to have one position, and then you turn and say, but the EU is going to do this, you are sadly mistaken. All the EU institutions that we have seen in Bosnia, and you now see in Kosovo, replicate very nicely the problems we have with the UN administration. So I urge you not to think that that's the solution. What has been missing here is a strong, dynamic vision by the United States that leads and unifies the relationship between the Atlantic, US, Canada, and the Europeans. And that's true in Kosovo, but it's also true in Bosnia. So.
Thank you.
My name is Nils Stojkova. I'm an undergrad student at Tufts University. My question is, a lot of the talks seem to revolve around the involvement of the US and the European Union. But I'm wondering, do you see any role for the countries on the Balkans themselves? Because one of you, I'm not sure, listed the stakeholders in the whole process of resolving the Kosovo issue, but I didn't really see all the Balkan countries on there. And I'd say they have a very big stake in resolving this issue, not at least in economic terms, but also in terms of improving the image of the Balkans in general. So what role do you see for the other Balkan countries? And I'm thinking of Bulgaria, Romania, Greece itself, and Turkey. Thank you.
We believe in our institute that sustainable solution has to come out of the affected peoples themselves. First of all, the peoples of Kosovo and Serbia and Montenegro, but then also the neighboring countries, of which the most directly affected encouraging sign has been that Slovenia, the richest part of former Yugoslavia and the one that bailed out early and safely, comparatively safely, has actually taken on a serious responsibility to help the remaining parts of the former Yugoslavia.
Yeah, if I understand the remarks from Ambassador Hayes from the previous session, I thought I heard that you didn't want to commit to a timeline with respect to OHR and other international community involvement in Bosnia. In fact, you didn't want to comment on the length at all. It was dependent on a whole bunch of other contingencies. And you seem to emphasize a learning curve. And I understand that. But if I understand you, Mr. Abramovich, you said the longer you stay in there, the worse your chances of ultimate success get. Now, in my mind, there's some sort of a conflict there. There's two schools of thought. One seems to emphasize a rising learning curve that we need to ride out and surf as far as we can. And another one emphasizes a rising tide of resentment or cynicism, probably among the local population with respect to these semi-colonial overseers. So I wonder if you guys could duke that one out a little bit, if you're feeling that conflict.
Well, let me make two comments. I'd also like to make one of Ambassador Hayes' comment. Every generalization has a problem. And by and large, I am a believer that you have to, and I don't think Ambassador Hayes would disagree with this, you have to, in a second, you have to get the local population to work as quickly as possible. You have to pass over responsibilities as quickly as possible. That did not happen in Kosovo because the structure of the agreement and the attitudes of the principal players did not want it to happen. And consequently, we have been left with a state that I call a non-failed state. In Bosnia, I think the first 5 years of OHR were a disaster. I think only in the last 5 years has it started to work. But I also believe that its future is limited too. And the longer occupations persist, I basically believe the worse it is in terms of generating the necessary support for the local populations. You have to look at each one, obviously, and decide. But as a general rule, I think engagement of the local people is absolutely urgent, and it didn't happen in a right way. We had elections, and that was great. And we didn't turn over anything. In Iraq, they don't have even elections, and we're turning everything over. So, you gotta look at each one. I want to make comment on the EU. I'm not a big fan of Eurobabble. There's too much, you hear too much about it, all sorts of European acronyms, etc. There's a difference, however, with the EU and the Balkans. And history has not been, remember that this was the hour of Europe and they all failed completely. On the other hand, the EU has a strong interest in that area not being a source of tension. They don't want more Albanians. They don't want more migration. They want it to work. Now, whether they have the ability and the capability to put things together to make it work, but they have far more interest in making it work than the UN, which tends to perpetuate itself. The longer it goes on, the more the second raters, then the third raters. They don't want to leave. So I believe the EU has a much more deeper interest in making this work. That doesn't mean it will work, but I'd rather give it to them than to the UN.
We have about 5 minutes, and we have a number of questions.
Yeah, I don't have a microphone, but I'll speak up. My experience is Bosnia, it's not Kosovo. But I'm surprised to see the slideshow there make a reference to an amendment to Dayton. You might not think that last administration, this administration, has been sufficiently engaged in Bosnia, but I'll tell you one thing, that they're not going to go down the road of amending Dayton. And there is no political, legal, or psychological link between Bosnia and Kosovo. When we saw the events in Kosovo in March, there was no resonance in Bosnia of those events. If anything, everyone of every political and ethnic persuasion did everything they could to make sure that there was no similar activity in that country. So I think the time has passed when you can talk about amending Dayton and about that as some sort of a contribution to the solution of Kosovo. Thanks.
I would only add a comment that the time, it seems to me that the time for discussion of a range of options vis-a-vis Kosovo has become exceedingly limited. That in reality, there is only one real viable option on the table, and that is some sort of independence. And I think any discussion of other options, I think the time has passed. The problem we face is that because the situation has languished over the last couple of years, the process toward independence has become much more difficult. And I think this is now a real problem. And I would only add, and I'll turn it back to you, Cliff, is to say that any discussion of Bosnia in the final status issues concerning Kosovo is out the table. And it has to be made clear that it's off the table. Because once you start down that road, there's no end to that process.
And I would just agree in that in Kosovo, I think, again, not someone who has any experience there, but coming from the situation I know something about in Bosnia, you need parameters for a settlement. Once those parameters are on the table, a lot of people are satisfied with Dayton, but once you've got something on the table that you're working with, people will carry on a real dialogue, a real discussion. People can hold out extreme hopes from whatever position you're coming at in Kosovo, I would say, until something is on the table and you're actually negotiating, you have those hopes, those expectations reach compromise.
Next question. Go way back to the corner. Oh, sorry, one more comment here.
If you look at my slide, you'll see I have a question mark about the incorporation of Bosnia into this LSE process. I do say, however, that were it to be combined in some way with looking at Kosovo, there would have to be a process beginning within the directly affected peoples to put options on the table. And the negotiations without that are not likely to be productive in Bosnia or in Kosovo.
Yes, ma'am.
I want to explain what conditional independence is and whether the genesis of it was from the Goldstone report.
We got the author
We
of
got the
that
author.
sitting up in the,
Paul Williams.
I think you know it, Bruce. That's
He's responsible for all this. Paul Williams, the Executive Director of Public Affairs. Would you talk about it a little bit?
Okay, I'll jump in on the panel. Conditional independence is essentially a process of phasing in the sovereignty or the independence of Kosovo to the extent in which they meet certain conditions with respect to refugee return, human rights, democratization, rule of law. It's the idea that rather than jumping to an immediate final status of independence, which could be chaotic to a certain extent and might not fully meet all of the objectives of the UN, the EU, or the Americans, you would sort of phase the process in over a period of time. You wouldn't go with standards as high as those in the standards before status approach, unattainable standards, which are used to hold it off for 5 or 10 years, but a very clear timetable over a period of 2 to 3 years with clear benchmarks, and as those benchmarks are met, greater power and authority is devolved to the self-governing institutions of Kosovo, ending up with full independence, membership in the UN, but with the possibility of perpetual conditions on territorial association with neighboring states. That's essentially it in a nutshell.
Thank you very much. The session has now come to an end, but I have 2 things to say. First, at the moment I'm going to turn it over to Glenn for some housekeeping issues. But I should also say